for Hollywood. Recently, we both of us viewed a film that came out on Netflix, and I just start off with that because it's very topical, called House of Dynamite, in which Kathryn Bigelow, which directed The Hurt Locker. She's a very recognized Hollywood filmmaker from Hollywood and America. She produced a film where the story basically was a 20-30 minute story of real time. If a missile is coming towards America, what would the president of the United States and the team around him that manage that situation, what are their options and what they would do? So it's very choreographed to get you to the point where the enemy is Russia, North Korea, possibly aided by China and Iran, without specifically making it clear, but enough information is given so the viewer would think that's what's happening, and that's we're as Americans under threat from these countries. And if there's some kind of an attack, even though we don't know who really is, we need to strike hard and we need to hit the Russians and the Koreans anyway, just to show whoever else attacked us not to mess with us. That's the message I got from the film. Now I just wanted to ask you, you can start with this film and then also explain to us how, from your research, how Hollywood is not just manipulated on indirect way, but how actually Hollywood is manipulated directly by the Pentagon, which is the defense department of the Department of War now, not defense, and the actual CIA and actual politics. Because recently you also produced a documentary called Theatre of War, where you discussed this with Oliver Stone, filmmaker Oliver Stone, and some other experts. So if you could just chime in onto that for us, starting with House of Dynamite.
Thank you very much, Reza, and good to meet you both. So yeah, House of Dynamite is a new Kathryn Bigelow film about a missile strike from an anonymous source, a bolt from the blue, which is due to hit Chicago. This is a really interesting film, I thought. Reza and I actually have disagreed quite strongly about the entertainment value of this movie. I found it quite entertaining, but then I'm quite easily entertained by the prospect of being annihilated. And Reza felt that it was very repetitive. The reception of the film has actually been quite curious. This isn't such a political point, but let me just point out that the critics have responded very positively to House of Dynamite on Netflix, which came out about a week ago. But the audience reaction has been appalling. There's been a slew of one-star reviews from ordinary members of the public who are frustrated by the repetitive nature of the drama, which essentially repeats the same scenes in three different ways throughout the film. I think that I'm not quite sure where to start, but let me point out that my research for the last 20 years has been about the representation of American foreign policy, mainly in cinema. As the years have gone by, I've started to look a little bit at how TV series have represented American power, how computer games have represented American power, or should I say misrepresented American power in a lot of cases. And I've also got a PhD student at the moment who's looking into how the British film industry does something similar, albeit on a much smaller scale. And one of the other changes in my research over the past 20 years has been that whereas for the first decade, really, I was looking at purely at representation, or very much largely at representation, around about 2014, 2015, I worked with an exceptional archivist and researcher called Tom Secker, and journalist who found a slew of documents showing that the amount of involvement by the Department of Defense and other agencies, including the CIA, had been underestimated. The involvement in actual script production and script changes had been underestimated by a multiple of several. Hard to measure exactly how much, but let's say that the historiography, such as it was probably underestimating the involvement of the Department of Defense and CIA and some other agencies like Homeland by, say, a factor of about 10. And so this was an important change in my research, and it showed a very much conscious manipulation by the national security state to rewrite and to manipulate and to control for political reasons and for geopolitical propaganda the representations of American power. It was also partly so that they can recruit soldiers. So, you know, that's the ostensible purpose of a film like Top Gun, is for recruitment. But actually, of course, it's also even more so on the quiet. It is about shaping attitudes to the rest of the world and shaping attitudes to the projection of American power. Now, specifically in the case of House of Dynamite, as it stands, Kathryn Bigelow, the director, has said that that she did not cooperate formally with the Department of Defense. However, we know from Kathryn Bigelow's earlier film, Zero Dark 30, from 2012, which was about the hunt for Osama bin Laden, that she does work very, very closely with these organizations. Whether that is officially termed cooperation with the Department of Defense or not is almost a moot point. And certainly I would very much suspect that when the history of this movie is written and more documentation has slowly leaked out, and indeed the Freedom of Information Act requests that myself and colleagues have put in have finally come through, that we will discover that Kathryn Bigelow was working very closely with powerful and politically motivated forces on this production. Now, why does that matter? I think for a particular reason in the case of House of Dynamite, which is that the nuclear war scenario. First of all, I think it's great to have films about nuclear war. It's really important. I mean, I think there's a consensus amongst political scientists and observers of the world that there is a genuine risk that we are going to destroy ourselves. I can't get away from that fact, and I know it's a horrible and depressing thing to put on a podcast, but it is a significant risk. And even if that risk was only hovering around 1%, it would still be a completely unacceptable risk as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's several times more a greater risk than that if you were able to put money on such a thing at a bookies, which of course they would never accept because they'd never need to pay out the results. So it is important to have films about nuclear war, but small changes in the political setup as represented can have big impacts on how we deal with nuclear war. In the case of House of Dynamite, it is presenting the idea of a one-off strike, probably by North Korea, using one missile, which then needs to be retaliated against immediately. Now, within that context that is being presented, yes, it does indicate that America is panicked, that America might make mistakes in its response, that it might be too hawkish. But actually what the film is largely doing is humanizing the American elite response. And it is saying that it is actually quite legitimate to launch on warning, to launch as soon as an attack is made, that there is a good case to be made that there needs to be massive retaliation, even before that missile, which, bear in mind, we don't even know if it's nuclear tipped, that there needs to be massive retaliation. They call that retaliation in the film either rare, medium, or well done, which implies either a small attack on, say, on Pyongyang, which might be the rare attack, or medium or well done, which presumably means obliteration of major military sites and nuclear sites across the great powers that are supposedly mobilizing to attack the United States. So this is a quite unusual, indeed implausible scenario for a nuclear attack. And it also elides the fact that in the real world, there really could be nuclear escalation, but through scenarios which are very much more the result of US policy. There could be a nuclear war over Ukraine due to, or at least in part due to excessive US pressure being applied and NATO pressure being applied on the Russian homeland. There could be a nuclear war that is generated by the US in collaboration with Taiwan, declaring de facto or even outright independence for that country, leading to a war, and then the United States only really being able to defend that island through threatening nuclear use. And there could indeed be a nuclear war if Israel miscalculates in its approach to Iran, if it believes that Iran is weaker than it is, and then is overwhelmed by some kind of heavy missile response from Tehran, bearing in mind that Israel is a very tiny country, and that last time there was an exchange of missiles, its stock exchange was hit. So for all of those reasons, the film is subtly presenting the idea that the US needs to be more invested in its weapons procurement program, more invested in its military-industrial complex, and more invested in defending against what seem to be, but are not really, security threats to its homeland. So for that reason, the film, despite I'm sure some good intentions and some dramatic ability and some really interesting acting and scripting, is a product which is embedded within the US national security state, which reflects the interests of the national security state, which the national security state itself has said this shows the need for more defense. This shows how deterrence can fail, and so we need to put more money into X, Y, and Z. So for that reason, the film is emblematic, really, of a Hollywood system which is very much in lockstep with the interests of the national security state, and that's why Tom Zecker and I wrote a book in 2017 called National Security Cinema, which has been translated into French in 2021. And various other work that came out alongside that, including the documentary Theaters of War, which is about the Pentagon and CIA's takeover of Hollywood. That was a very long answer, I just realized, but I was kind of on a roll, and you're very welcome to interrupt me. I wouldn't consider it rude.
I want to add something before I pass it on. I've noticed in Netflix that, especially in the last few years, there's a sleuth. There's just, abundance of films specifically made for Netflix where CIA agents, be they women agents or men agents, are the heroes, are the protagonists. Basically, the film revolves around an agent who is a CIA agent. I remember like films from the 80s, the 70s, the 60s. CIA agents were they weren't shown in a positive way. But however, since I think the 2000s, whenever it was, when they opened the liaison office and they learned from the Pentagon or from the Department of Defense to actually liaise with the filmmakers because it's in their benefit, and give them some kind of access here and there, but then demand for them to have access to the script. It feels like Netflix has gone even beyond that and is trying to present the CIA where Donald Trump, at some times they talk about wrapping it up because it's just so dangerous, which they will never do because they're using it right now to attack Venezuela and other places. That the CIA, being part of the deep state, is just trying to be shown in such a positive light that when CIA is mentioned now, it's not such a negative term anymore like it was 30, 40 years ago. Can you just talk about that? What if you've noticed that as well in Netflix and other films, like, for example, Argo that came out, things like that? Have you noticed there's been a shift in the deep state trying to utilize films, Hollywood? And I include Netflix in Hollywood now because Netflix is basically the modern interpretation of Hollywood, right? Along with the major studios. What's your views on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Venezuela is an interesting case, just given the situation in Venezuela that's escalated over the past 2 or 3 weeks, where the United States has parked a massive aircraft carrier off its shore, and has been blowing out of the water various small ships, supposedly because they're packed with drug dealers. But I don't think anyone actually takes that remotely seriously. The only substance that Venezuela has of any interest is oil, not cocaine, so or fentanyl for that matter. So Venezuela is being presented very negatively under the Maduro government. It has been since the 90s, and the efforts to present it badly in the media have arguably been escalated. Certainly, certainly in terms of entertainment products, it's interesting that there was a Jack Ryan TV series on, I think it was on Amazon Prime, actually, a couple of years ago. I don't think it was Netflix. There was a Jack Ryan series where they speculated about Venezuela trying to acquire a nuclear weapon. Do you remember this, Reza? They dramatized the idea that Venezuela was trying to acquire a nuke, and they even said in the trailer to the film, if Venezuela acquires a nuclear weapon, then there will be no New York tomorrow. So, you know, the idea that Venezuela is even more insane than these other insane dictators that have been around the world. So yeah, Venezuela is an interesting case. Jack Ryan being used as a to dramatize that situation in a negative way, and in general about the CIA. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a slightly more nuanced situation over the past 80 years of the CIA's existence, or coming up 80 years. In terms of its involvement with the entertainment industry, there was certainly a period in the 1970s and 80s, as you very astutely identify, Reza, where the CIA was being used as a kind of default bad guy, particularly the kind of rogue CIA villain. And this even goes up to the Oliver Stone movie JFK from 1991, of course, where the CIA is quite explicitly shown to be the assassin, the conspirators behind the assassination of President Kennedy. And there was a concerted effort. In fact, there was a movie in the early 90s, which I think was, I always forget it, but it's one, forget the name, but I think it's one with John Malkovich, where he plays another one of these disgruntled CIA agents who tries to murder a politician. And I see the names skip my mind for the moment, but it's around about that period, early 1990s, where the CIA said, look, we've had enough of this. We've had the last decade or two being presented as default baddies, and we don't want that anymore. And that's when they brought in Chase Brandon, who was a very well-connected, very smart, very shrewd CIA operative who had been behind enemy lines in various different theaters of conflict, but also had a cousin in Tommy Lee Jones and lots of connections in Hollywood. And Chase did a very thorough and involved job from the mid 1990s in manipulating behind the scenes and getting in very early on TV series like 24, for example, without really a great deal of detection or fanfare. So he was able to make huge changes there. And then the CIA has been professionalized as an organization within Hollywood since then. I would just make a quick note, just because it was very interesting when Tom Secker and I were doing the historiography on this about the 40s and 50s, because again, what little has been out there by historians suggests that the CIA basically did nothing in Hollywood in the 40s and 50s. That is not correct. We were able to really go through that with a fine-tooth comb, and it was very interesting. They were so quiet. They were so quiet behind the scenes. But partly because of their efforts, they were able to achieve two things. One, they made 3 films in 1946, which glorified the OSS, the forerunners to the CIA. And at least by the main historians, the original historians' own belief, laid out in a press release, the CIA might not even have existed were it not for that media terrain to be astroturfed at the very beginning, because it laid the groundwork for the CIA as heroic. And the second thing that the CIA was able to achieve from its inception until at least until well into the 60s was that it was simply not mentioned at all in any Hollywood production. Now, that might have been partly a cultural thing, but it was also partly that they were preventing that the mention simply of the three-letter agencies being out there in movies. It was North by Northwest in 1959 by Alfred Hitchcock, where the acronym CIA was even first mentioned or shown in any Hollywood movie, and even then they cut off the C on a piece of signage that's being shown. And really, it wasn't until well into the 60s that the CIA was acknowledged in cinema. In fact, it was I think it was the first James Bond film, Dr. No, in 1962, where the CIA is even mentioned in passing. And of course, then they're mentioned in a very laudatory way. So the CIA has been effective in Hollywood. It's not a uniquely different thing that's happened over the past sort of 25 years since Chase Brandon got involved. But they have certainly professionalized their involvement, and they've become more involved in actually shaping scripts from the outset in the past quarter century. Whereas initially they were basically just preventing them even being anyone even being aware that they existed.
I'll pass it to Grace or Mont so that you can ask a question as well.
Please ask if you want me to give shorter answers. It's the longest answer I think I've ever given.
I think we need clear explanations for this stuff because it's such a complex issue.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're doing great, Dr. Matthew, and thank you, Dr. Reza. It's just really sad that the creativity of human being had been weaponized, and they've been weaponized for decades. And when, like me and other people who just really learning much more on how weaponized Hollywood is like kind of sad, like, oh, that's my favorite actor, oh, my favorite actress, oh, so, and then you lose like interest. Do you go to the movie or not go to the movie? But there's always, I haven't met anyone who never wanted to see a movie, whether it's going to the theater or at home. So there's always that thing. And of course, there's always a conversation of when we say, does films reflect life, or does life imitate the movies? And in my own perspective, it can be both. So that's really and that was very good initial conversation that you both had. But I was just wondering if you know any stories, or you have stories of any filmmaker or journalist who was able to push back, or if they had a career sabotage for challenging official war narratives. And maybe you could cite some examples. And my follow-up question would be also, with the digital world, the social media, from TikTok to Telegram to Facebook, and how does the algorithms and short form storytelling, especially those just bits. Well, I guess what I'm saying, which one is more effective in really programming us, the short ones or the long ones? There was recently, I went to a theater and I can't take it. I had to really exit. I had to stay out and wait for my company. So if you have those stories for us.
Yeah, so I'll be a bit shorter on that, I think. I think cinema can be really impactful because you are in a darkened space, you're in a communal space. When Woodrow Wilson, US president, first watched Birth of a Nation, he described it, this was the very early days of cinema. He said it was like history being written by lightning, which is a really nice phrase basically to say, this is very powerful, it's very fast, the film gets right into your head like electricity. And he was referring in particular to the film Birth of a Nation, which I'm sure you'll know is a horribly racist Ku Klux Klan supporting movie where the heroes ride in on horseback to crush a black rebellion. And that film led to the rise of what was known as the Second Klan. So whereas the Ku Klux Klan had been relatively weak until then, it generated within a few days and a few weeks from there several tens of thousands of new members. That was a very clear impact of one film from the 1910s having a decisive political effect. As to whether that means that short clips are more important than long ones, I don't know. I mean, I do know that there's a huge debate about media effects that rolls on and on for the past 120 years. You know, this is why you get people saying, oh, well, that shooter or whatever, you know, was watching too many video games. And, you know, there's a danger in always saying, well, every bit of media is incredibly dangerous and will have an effect on our youth or have an effect on our brains or send us crazy. I think we have to be a little bit careful not to always fall into those kind of tabloid responses and interpretations. But it certainly can happen that, particularly if you're showing the same idea again and again and again, that it can have deeper ideological effects rather than simply reflecting values in society. So that's one thing I'd say from a historical basis, and there is some research that suggests that, in fact, the film, I think it was Zero Dark 30 that they did do some psychological audience tests on, and they did find that the trust in American institutions went much higher after people watched that film because it heroized the CIA. So, you know, the responses that people have, the responses that audiences have to media are kind of fairly predictable, but it's quite hard to pin down for certain the results. You also asked me about when film directors have gone against the grain. Well, I mean, there are some dramatic cases of that. I mean, Jean Seberg in the 1970s, for example, who'd starred in the film Airport. You know, she gave a bit of cash to the Black Panthers and ended up having the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, leak negative information about her having had an affair with a black man, and this led to her having not an abortion, led to her having a miscarriage. She ended up killing herself. Her husband ended up dying shortly afterwards for related reasons. So there are dramatic cases like that. There are other dramatic cases involving entertainment figures who I'm sure lots of people will know. John Lennon was not allowed into had all sorts of problems at the border for years and years and years, supposedly because he, I think, had a bit of cannabis on him at one point or another, but obviously it was because he was a peace campaigner. Charlie Chaplin similarly had a huge FBI file on him, and that was largely, at least, because he declared himself to be a socialist. And more recently, and in still alive, someone like Oliver Stone has talked in recent years in his autobiography about the sort of crushing difficulties just psychologically of just facing this kind of welter of establishment hatred, as indeed as Michael Moore. So there are all sorts of cases like that, but I think you know, of star figures who have been sort of treated very badly by the system. You know, I guess on a slightly more personal level, Marilyn Monroe, rather than, you know, she didn't she wasn't necessarily politically opposed, but, you know, all these people can get caught up within the system and have a lot of difficulties. So but just more generally, just any kind of ideological pushback against the system as a whole is always going to cause is always going to cause you difficulties. Whereas the Kathryn Bigelows of this world, which is not to say she's a bad person or completely pro-military or whatever, but, you know, she fits nicely into that little scene because she's able to be very, very interesting and creative, but without tipping over into those what the Pentagon calls the showstoppers. She won't mention the things like drug use in the military, nuclear weapons going out of control. She won't mention the problems of mental illness in the military or assault in the military. She won't talk about the nasty conspiracies that the Pentagon once referred to that need to be excised from scripts. She won't talk about the prevalence of the oil industry or the financial industry and its pressures on American foreign policy. All those kind of things that are explicitly referred to as showstoppers by the Pentagon means that she can fit into that into that world and make creative and interesting decisions. So, you know, in the movie, in the House of Dynamite movie, it's really intriguing seeing the laminated folder of nuclear responses that the president can give. You don't normally see the laminated folder. That was an idea that was raised through the research of Annie Jacobson last year when she produced the book, excellent journalist, Nuclear War: A Scenario, where she said that the list of options that is given to the US president to retaliate in the event of an attack looks like a Denny's diner menu, a Denny's breakfast menu. So someone like Kathryn Bigelow has said to herself, I can use that creatively. It is a really intriguing, creative idea, but you can have these really intriguing, creative ideas when you're already safe within an ideological system. So yeah. I said that was going to be a short answer, and I didn't achieve it. It's because you're all looking.
I want
like
to add two things.
You have to look a bit more bored when you want me to stop, and then I'll pick up on the signal.
No, it's fine because I wanna add two things that you said. So to answer Grace's question about short form and long form, I think short form is very important. Otherwise, the Zionist lobby, you know, headed by Netanyahu, would not push for TikTok to be bought by the Ellison, billionaire, because then they can control what message and what news it disseminates amongst the youth. Now, do you want to have a discussion about the short form lessen the IQ or the intelligence of its viewers? Is a different discussion. We can have that. Obviously, having books and reading books is very important. So that's a different discussion. But the importance of it, there's no doubt. Obviously, otherwise, 3-4 individuals, billionaires, wouldn't be owning Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and 2-3 others which are used by most of the Western world, other than China, that has its own thing. And going back to filmmakers who were blacklisted, I remember seeing the speech by Vanessa Redgrave in 1978 when she raised the issue of Zionist hoodlums. Back then, this is almost 50 years ago. She's discussing that she's trying to advocate for Palestinian rights, and she's been attacked by the Zionists in Hollywood and outside of Hollywood, the lobbyists. And since then, as you said, Oliver Stone. There was also I found another name that was interesting, that from the filmmakers, that Orson Welles. This is back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and FBI had files on him. These are names that we know. There's obviously many other filmmakers from the 50s, where I think it was the McCarthy era, where they were rounding up anyone who didn't follow that idea of we need to create enemy, and it has to be Soviet, the communist Soviets, and anyone who has any empathy with ideas that they have, which are it could be valid, like providing social services and having unions, and unions should be able to strike against bad working conditions and so forth. Oh, they're communist, you can't have that, whatever. So I think that this battle has always gone on, but I think that the deep state has always had the upper hand in the United States with the filmmakers. And one of its ways of doing it is blatant, with people like the filmmaker of Transformers, or the filmmakers that make Top Gun, which is just blatant, propaganda for the military. And then you have the ones which are a little bit more smart and sophisticated, but obviously we pick it up really easily, are people like Kathryn Bigelow and other filmmakers, where, like, or for example, when what's his name, Ben Affleck made Argo, or other filmmakers, where there's kind of like, oh, there's a bit of a tension and they're showing something negative, but underneath the actual message that is trying to be driven home is the message that the deep state wants. And I believe that the deep state goes far beyond what even Donald Trump represents at the moment, and him saying that he's trying to, counter the deep state. I think he's part of the whole deep state process of making people think that there is a opposition to the Democrats. So I just wanted to add those two things. Sorry, I'll give it back to Grace.
Well, thank you so much. Both are very opening perspective for me. And I agree to both, because there is that, coming from a health professional mind in terms of psychology, there is that power when you are really in that dark environment, even when you're studying and for other things, and you're meditating, so that has that power. But at the same time, as you said, with all this miseducation or mistraining for proper education, and not even wanting to read books, so that short-term memory, those TikToks are good for short-term memory and their repetition. Wow, that sounds like these are all, it came all from an MK Ultra, programming. So so we gotta be careful, really. But I was also wondering, since almost all countries now can make their own movies, right, and more popular, are there any, at least, filmmakers or film industry from other countries that at least a little bit more reliable, or it kind of helps more promote their culture in a positive way, and not to really dismantle their culture? Because for me, owning and really keeping your culture is important. So is there, in your study and observation, for you, Dr. Matthew, and also Dr. Reza, because you're both filmmakers, is there anything? Because my experience lately, I try to look at certain Chinese film that I really like, and even once in a while Japanese, but the Chinese films do not disappoint me much, whether it's new film or old films. There's always that thing that I could learn, and that could give me back my empowerment for being who I am. So, share us, like, all these other crazy movies.
I'll start, but I think probably that Reza, and indeed yourself, Grace, might have more to contribute on international cinema. Every country has some kind of cinematic industry. South Africa, India, Pakistan, and so on. I mean, the United States is unusual in the extent to which the national security state is embedded very quietly and very extensively in its entertainment output. Now, can I compare exactly that with other countries? Not very well, because I've not studied properly a comparative politics study of various different nations. And partly that's because I just think that the priority needs to be to expose what the United States is doing, because it's so dangerous, having the world's worst weapons combined with an entertainment industry and a very trigger happy establishment. I mean, so I don't particularly care too much about what Japan can be saying all sorts of terrible, horrible things in its cinema industry if it likes. I'd prefer it wasn't, but if it is, it's not as serious as what the United States is doing geopolitically at the moment, and in terms of its propaganda apparatus. But I would say that what we've discovered with military involvement in Britain in our entertainment system is greater than we expected it to be, through my PhD student, Tarek, but will take a few years to get results there. I do know from speaking to Russian colleagues that, the Russian national security state is also very much involved in its film industry, and of course in China. It is very much involved in its film industry, and there have been some more gung-ho militaristic products that have come out of China, including, I think it was called Wolf Warrior, a series called Wolf Warrior, I think, in the past 10 years. So there have been changes there. I don't want to overemphasize the importance of the national security state in the United States in terms of its involvement in Hollywood, because other nations do that. But I think that the implications of and the extent to which it is done in other nations is, for lots of different reasons, not quite as important. Even though those countries, especially China and Russia, probably have a grip, if they wanted to, over certain products that is as much, if not greater, than in the United States. But the question is, I mean, so for example, what Russian films or Chinese films do actually have a propaganda impact to do with foreign policy? Both of those nations are, at least until 2022, I should say, were certainly traditionally for several decades much more restrained in terms of their foreign policy, their projection of power overseas, whereas the United States is very different in that regard, as is Britain, which is one of the main reasons I've focused on that. But Reza, you'll know better from Iranian cinema for a start, but probably various other countries that you've lived in and had contact with about how important national cinemas are.
So Iran, I'm going to give a quick comment and then pass it to Monty, because he's patiently been waiting to add as well. Iran has a national cinema, but it also has so the national cinema is divided into private and divided into state-sponsored, or how would I say it, like public, not public, but films that are sponsored by sponsorship or finance from the state cultural sector. I think we have them also in the UK, where there is the national is it the national fund or the lottery fund, but sometimes they support filmmaking. So there is that. However, the private sector is bigger and more popular in its ticket sales. And also there was that discussion in Iran where filmmakers would then get accused, similar to America, of being too close to either the military establishment or the state sponsor government or whatever, when they were making some films that seem to be patriotic or propagandistic or whatever. So I think that's it's in an open society where you can have that discussion. I don't know about China or Russia, but in Iran, you see newspapers challenge some filmmakers who are close to those entities, state entities. So I think it's a situation that exists in most countries. But what the point that you made, which is really relevant, and kind of answered the question that I had a little bit later, was why is it important for us to even care about if filmmakers in Hollywood are getting influenced by the Department of War and CIA? It's because most of the world sees these films. Even though India produces more films than Hollywood, most of the world, if I'm in Oman, I'm seeing American movies. If I go to Iran, you can buy it, download it and buy them DVDs, or you even see them, dubbed on Iranian Netflix versions of Iranian platforms that are on demand, video on demand. Or if you go to Latin America or Asia, you see American movies everywhere. So that's why I think it's important that people understand that it's not just entertainment. It's embedded ideologies, sometimes blatant, sometimes really well made, sometimes very subtle, that impacts how people think, especially if that's the only point of reference for these individuals of these ethnicities or these groups of people or these institutions that they have access to. If I'm some individual who's based somewhere in Europe, I have access to, I don't have access to Arabs or Afghans. Whatever film that shows me what Afghans look like, I'm going to think that's what the reality is. Not on purpose, but that's because that's the only thing I've seen. So that's why I think you're right. It's important that you continue challenging this ideology that's embedded in Hollywood films and unmasking it for the audience and making them realize that's fine, go and watch it, but at least be able to have the critical thinking ability to dissect it, to see that you're not propagandized, you're not, ideology is not embedded in you without you challenging it, without you critiquing it. So I think that's a very important point that you raised that answer the question that I was going to ask. So I'm going to pass it to Monty now. I think he wanted to add something.
Thank you very much. Most fascinating subject matter, and I appreciate the work you've done in bringing this together and focusing on mass psychological operations and the involvement of military intelligence service and so forth. I'm reminded, it brings back to me remembrance of secret societies, which have really been, goes back millennia to Babylon, to the cult of Mithra, in swaying public opinion and changing the narrative on things. And I'm reminded of Edward Bernays, who was the son of Sigmund Freud, who really was instrumental in making this a science of mass propaganda and mass psychology and engineering public opinion. And this has been around for millennia. My exposure to it specifically was with in Vietnam with Operation Phoenix, and went on around that particular subject matter. But what I was reminded of in relationship to this was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with Admiral Morrison and his, which brought about a fake operation to get us involved in Vietnam, which really was the beginning at this concurrently with the drug, sex, and roll counter-revolution, which was brought about by various CIA operations in Hollywood. In particular, Jim Morrison was the son of this admiral who was in Hollywood at that time. And a fellow by the name of David McCullough wrote a book, Weird Sins Inside the Canyon, which outlined the whole military, intelligence, media, and academic complex in Hollywood at that time. They actually had a secret Air Force base, Lookout Mountain in Laurel Canyon at the time, which was at the time the largest world's film production studio. It was secret. And like 200,000 square feet of space, they had the most modern kind of things. And this was engineered to use film, media, Hollywood, and the military in order to co-opt the whole anti-war movement into drugs, sex, and rock and roll counterculture. And they were very effective in doing this, and I think we're still facing that today, whereas these secret societies who have an agenda insofar as depopulation, keeping people stupid, keeping them emotionally fearful, keeping them downtrodden. So I'm just reminded in your work of how that goes back and how effective it's been in the United States to perpetuate this.
So let me take it further. That was a good point added, that the academia, the media, the deep state intelligence, and the military kind of come together to have such big impact. And the media is very powerful. When we say media, we're obviously talking about Hollywood and the other mainstream media apparatuses and platforms that exist, TV and radio, and specifically newspapers that are very important in setting agenda. Where, because in my studies, what I noticed is that Hollywood doesn't necessarily set agendas. What Hollywood does is reinforce agendas that is set by the mainstream media, which is newspapers, followed by radio and TV. So if you look, New York Times will put something up, and the other major newspapers that follow that kind of political ideology, and the TV channels amplify it, make it something that becomes fact, even if it's not. And what Hollywood does is then reflect it in its movies. So it's not Hollywood that created the Russia Gate and the, Russophobia or the Koreaphobia. But what Hollywood does is reference it, and because it already exists in the main culture, it's the what did Gramsci call it? He called it the common sense, the thing that everybody thinks is normal and common sense, and they've already heard it so much on news and newspapers and radio that when they see it in a film, they don't challenge it because they think, oh, they're just reflecting what their reality is. So that manufacture of consent has been already created by the mainstream media, and Hollywood just uses it to best effect. Because what Hollywood does is it brings in some of the oldest forms of art that have captivated humans and brought spiritual development in humans. So the spoken word, the written word, the ability art of playwriting and telling stories, the art of music goes back thousands of years, and more recently the art of painting that we have, where you could sit there for hours and imagine the scenery that's been painted for you. And what has become popular with the film is combining all of that. So in 2 hours, you get all of those experiences. And it's such a powerful experience that when you leave, and if it's done really well by people like Kubrick or by people like, filmmakers like Orson Welles, where they thought that, when he did his radio show, there's actually Martians that have attacked United States, New York. There was panic, right? Because it was done so well. And that was even without video. It was just like audio, word, and storytelling. So this combination is very important, like Monty said, and how it can co-opt and direct. For example, at the moment, the Free Palestine movement. What films will come out where it will direct this energy towards another direction? We have to see. That's for us to find out in a few years. If it gets to that, let's see. Hopefully, maybe there'll be a revolution and things will change in the United States and Europe. But we can only live in hope. Is there anything you're working on currently now other than the Theater of War? That was something you recently did. Is there anything else you're working on a book or any other documentaries? Because I know you have your hands in some things, but I just wanted to. And also, you recently traveled to Russia. So if you could maybe mention how that was.
How long do we have though? Because I can comment as well on the inversion of meaning as well that you were referring to just then.
Take as much as time you need. We're happy to be here for one as long as you need.
Okay, I'll try and be try and do that reasonably. So I mean, I think there are a million different small things that come out from, like you say. I agree that Hollywood doesn't set an agenda. But Hollywood can reinforce this idea of common sense. And that's why, when anyone ever says you haven't got any common sense, then say, well, Antonio Gramsci says that you shouldn't have common sense because that sense is common and is therefore ideologically driven. And Gramsci, I think, is quite right about that. So, I mean, there's a million examples, but just the one that came to mind is that President Reagan believed that if he fired nuclear weapons at Russia, and then he'd made a mistake, that he could actually press a button that would send them off course or destroy the missile. So he thought he had a longer period of time. And eventually his generals said to him, no, sir, if you send a volley of nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union, you can't call them back. They're gone. It's done. So there's a tiny thing that just comes from that sort of common sense. You've seen it so many times in the movies, you think it's real. I was just flicking through my notes here, and I was reminded of the Julian Assange film starring Benedict Cumberbatch, which was called We Steal Secrets. Now, We Steal Secrets sounds like it is what Julian Assange did, what WikiLeaks did. Did they steal secrets? Well, they were given secrets. In fact, oftentimes they were just given memoranda that should be in the public domain by other people. They didn't actually steal secrets. They didn't hack secrets. We Steal Secrets, the film title from 2015, actually comes from a statement by a former head of the CIA who said, "We're the ones who steal secrets." but that meaning was inverted and then placed on a film explicitly about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, which therefore taints him and taints that that institution with theft. So there are a million examples of that, and I think that happens all the time. And sometimes, like you said, Reza, sometimes that's insidious, sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes whatever. But it's an issue if we are trying to understand our world in a very clear way, which obviously we have to do when we are in an era of where there is an uptick in genocide and war, and obviously the threat of everything melting down. Okay, in answer to your other question, yeah, I have been to Russia. Really interesting trip. Not quite sure what to say about it. I sort of went partly because I just thought this will be really intriguing and unusual. And I will put out ideas about that in the months and years to come. I do almost everything these days through YouTube and Substack, where I am called the Scourge of the Spin Machine, which is how I've renamed it over the last few months. My kids said to me, "We don't know what scourge is and we don't know what spin is." And I said, well, it's not for you then, is it? So I'm not sure how popular the channel will be, but Scourge of the Spin Machine on Substack and on YouTube. I will put out reflections on the trip I made to Russia. I met lots of interesting people there, as you can imagine, lots of viewpoints about the conflict in Ukraine. And I knew an academic out there who was very interesting for all sorts of different reasons. It also was good to go to Russia because I know this sounds silly, but when I booked the trip to go to Russia, I thought, I try and be open-minded and I try not to be propagandized by films, but even when I booked the hotel in Moscow, I thought, I'll just book a hotel in the middle of Moscow and just hope that it's okay. I imagined it would be a huge Soviet-style skyscraper, like all falling apart with like dilapidated walls and like electric like cables coming down from the roof, like zzz, all that kind of thing. And of course it wasn't. It was just a cute little hotel when I got there. Absolutely fine. Like 2-story hotel, like delightful place. So it's interesting. I mean, travel's just obviously good for one's soul. I think that's as enough of an answer as I should give for now.
I find that we're all traumatized by Hollywood in one sense or another, because like you're not. I'm from Iran, right? So there's no reason for them to pick on you. You're a white English man.
Yep.
So you don't. The only way they pick on you is like, oh, he's a. You get the best British villains, like Die Hard or whatever. That's like the worst that comes, right? So you've been propagandized to the point where you're an actual academic, and people rely on you to break this stuff down. And subconsciously, you're traveling to the country that they've demonized so much, and it's not true, but in your head, that kind of plays. Mm-hmm. And it's the same for us. Like, so when I see a film and a Muslim or Arab or Iranian is demonized, it's very difficult for me to say, oh, I love this filmmaker. I love Michael J. Fox, but in this film, they're showing Muslims in a negative way. I do really love watching Steven Spielberg films, or, I grew up loving James Cameron, but then when you made True Lies, where the baddies are Arabs and they're constantly talking in Arabic, or it's just, they've been blown away and anything Arab, in the film is negative. Are you thinking, I love this guy though. He made Terminator 2 and he's made Avatar and he's such a great filmmaker and he's a pioneer. And I love Arnold. I grew up watching him and all his films, but then he played this guy. So you do get traumatized because your brain has to make sense of this by continuing to, like Grace said, love these personalities, because we all love movies, because we all love stories, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to then compartmentalize your identity and what you believe and how you feel about things, because you want to continue to watch Back to the Future because it's such a good film. It's a film that stood test of time. Okay, it has some racist bits in it, but overall it's such an entertaining, and it's just Doc Brown and everything. Or True Lies is a really good remake of the French film. It's very entertaining, but it's also very racist and Islamophobic, right? So we all get basically Hollywood is traumatizing the world, and the world doesn't even realize it. They only realize it is when they come out of that cocoon and say, hold on a minute, I've just been to Iran or Russia or whatever that they've, decided to be, North Korea or whatever. And it's not bad as, I don't know, maybe North Korea is, but no, it's not as bad as they made it out, right?
Yeah.
I've actually, these people are really nice. They've invited me to their homes and they invited me to their universities and we're having conversations, and they're human beings like me. They're just slightly different, skin tone, and have different language they speak, and some other different value ideas and values or whatever. But ultimately, we all bleed red. So how the hell has Hollywood been able to co-opt and hijack my brain and my conscious so much that even though when I go to visit or I'm from that country, I'm like scared of things that I shouldn't be scared of. So I think that, as you said, it's very important that you continue
even to your own country. That's interesting.
No, I'm not scared of going to Iran. Basically Iran is the only country I go to without having to hide my phone. I'm like, you want my phone to see what's in it? Here you go. It's just if I want to come to the UK, I think about it twice.
Well, I mean, I think just to bounce off that point, I mean, I do think that the xenophobia angle on this is incredibly important, and foreign policy depictions are very important. But I think it's always worth remembering that what entertainers are trying to do is keep your attention. And so even look at a film like Adolescence, the TV series earlier this year, which was about stabbings in Britain. They're trying to keep your attention, and it's about a 12-year-old who stabs someone. It's a fictional series, brilliantly made again, but look up the statistics. How many 12-year-olds have ever stabbed anyone in Britain? None. How many the year before? Last year? None. The year before? None. Year before that? None. Like, just, it doesn't happen. But if they'd made a TV series that said, oh, a 17-year-old has stabbed someone, no one would care, because it happens occasionally. It happens about 60 times a year in the whole of Britain, a population of 70 plus million people, which is obviously really bad and it's newsworthy. But they're tricking, really, the audience into saying, hey, why don't you be frightened about this? Hey, parents, your kids could end up doing this. And yeah, it is true, but not at 12 and not at 13 either, actually. You look at the statistics, there's basically no one below 15 who gets involved in stabbing. But anything that is anything that's on screen is there to keep your attention, to advertise things for and to make money in whatever way. And that can lead to really perverse and wrong messages being thrown out, including racist and xenophobic messages, including from people who probably don't even remotely think that. Arnold Schwarzenegger was not trying to be horrible about Muslims in True Lies, but it just came across like that because it was convenient for the to get eyeballs on his film. And in fact, that's why, as you well know, Reza, Jamie Lee Curtis, the co-star of that film, said, she literally said, that film, it's funny. And then as soon as 9/11 happened, she said, it's not funny anymore. And it's like, yeah, it's not, because the mood has shifted. And so you can't treat this like a cartoon anymore. I'm not really criticizing her for saying that. I'm just saying that it's very easy within an entertainment system for film producers and TV producers to allow slight errors and slight misrepresentations to slide. And that can lead to, particularly when it's done systematically, and particularly then when the military get involved and then tweak it a bit themselves, you can end up having a very distorted idea of how society and international politics works.
But I think what you said about Adolescence, I haven't seen it yet, but from my understanding is it also relies on this fear of children being misguided through social media, right?
Yes.
And so I think in the story, he becomes influenced by that and stabs the kid, right? So if you look, most successful films have something that they rely on that is a fear factor within society, and they adapted. And a lot of the horror films or films that were produced during the height of the Cold War were based on Russian invasion or communist invasions or communist ideology and stuff like that. So this idea that that you mentioned is very true, that they take something, they emphasize and sometimes dial up the stereotype that exists in that common sense that we mentioned. Gramsci said exists in society, that was perpetuated by the newspapers and the TV news and so forth and so on, just because it makes it easier, especially because of the way that they want to have a good and a bad guy, where there's lack of nuance. So films like True Eyes and whatever, we just need to know who the good guy and bad guy, who to root for and who not to root for. But what happens is, when you have all of these elements, you end up perpetuating a lie that every time you see an Arab, he's going to be a terrorist. And so if you go to an airport and someone is praying in Arabic for the plane to arrive safely, people who don't know Arabs call the steward to say, oh, this person is speaking Arabic, they're planning to blow up the... No, the person's praying, I want to get, most people, when Arabs or Muslims, when they go on a plane, we pray that the plane arrives safely, that nobody dies. But because the stereotype has twisted that thing that you said earlier, inverted the reality, so it becomes something else to the masses. So I think, again, as I said, it does need a lot of dissecting, but in a way where maybe academia is good, but it needs to be dissected for the populace. So podcasts like this, and I think you attend many other podcasts and many other programs, and you do speeches through Toastmasters and so forth. These ideas through humor and entertainment of dissecting what is being implanted as ideology is really, really needed. Otherwise, we're going to have a group of people. Like I had a little chat on GB News a couple of days ago, right? And I was trying to explain to the Reform Party, Darren Grimes or whatever his name is like, why are you attacking the council? It's the government, by law, it's the government who is housing asylum seekers when they enter the country. It's the government. The government has signed a $15 billion contract with 4 or 5 companies that are close to the government to make them rich so they can house these asylum seekers. If they took that money, I calculated it, and you're gonna build 150, 200,000 homes over 10 years and create 21,000 jobs every year for the 10 years for homes that would be used constantly for whoever is needed it. And the guy is like, no, he had to focus on the racist aspect of the issue instead of me trying to explain facts to him. So I think there is a place for us to continue dissecting it. And I think you do a great job at doing that. And this show does a great job of doing that, dissecting it and keeping it lighthearted and making people understand, one person at a time, that that's fine. Watch True Lies and enjoy it. I enjoy it, but learn that what you see, especially to do with race and that kind of stuff and religion, is not necessarily a reality of what exists. And you made a very good point, which I would encourage everyone, and I've said this to Grace, and I also invite Monty, travel and come to Iran, come to Russia, come to all of these countries, even if it's for a week. Because once you come and you see for yourself, it's not what you thought it is. It does make a great difference. And when you go back, you have that energy, you have that enlightenment where you can talk from a personal perspective, as opposed to, I have a friend who's been, or I have a friend who's gone. You say it yourself, you share your own experience. So that's my 2 cents.
There's really no excuse for good travel, because I noticed that the people who are most critical against certain country or culture are those people who've never even set foot on that country. And sometimes, because of they were influenced with a lot of these movies, the picture in their mind is way, way, way back. At least it never changed. The situation never changed. So, but if there's one more message that you could, share to the next generation of content creators about truth in media, what would that be, Dr. Matthew and Dr. Reza?
One message that I would share to content creators for the future about what they could or should do.
I think maybe Grace is saying that from your experience of how, media manufactures consent, how would you tell them to go forward, either producing content or to deal with the content that they consume?
I mean, that's very much up. I think, I mean, there's an obvious answer, which is follow your conscience. But that's one simple piece of advice for life, I suppose. I'd say the other thing, just in terms of speaking as a political analyst, I would say that there is one good trend through the internet and social media over the last few years, which is long form content. You could I mean, take this with a pinch of salt, but I would say that anything that is short, that it can be that is a sound bite, that is a tweet, or anything that is in the genre of entertainment, is pretty much worthless in terms of understanding the way the world works. I mean, if you've got an advertising slogan, it's not going to be of any value. So to actually understand an issue, even quite a straightforward issue, I think you really need to give that issue time and space, for at least an hour or two, and really talk it through and think it through on many different angles. So I think those long form discussions, I'm not necessarily talking about Joe Rogan, who goes, might speak for 3 hours, but kind of waffles into a million different areas, which is also good, but that's still entertainment. That is not actually critically reflecting on different things. That is, it's fun. But again, that is in the genre of entertainment. So I guess my message would be, if you really put me on the spot, is to say that the entertainment is worthless except for as entertainment. So if you want to be useful in the world politically, and to get to the right answers, you really have to take the long form and really get into the topic in great detail. But of course, then there's a trade-off in terms of whether you get an audience for that. But there is an audience for longer form things. Even what BBC Radio does is often very successful in that regard. So I would encourage people to follow their conscience, ignore entertainment, ignore sound bites, and get into topics in intriguing and innovative and creative ways from lots of different angles.
And Monty, did you want to add something as well?